For nearly 50 years, his power was unmatched.
Hoover was an icon.
As head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover knew what everyone else wanted to keep hidden.
Hoover recognized information as power, which is why he maintained secret files.
Files so scandalous, all of Washington feared him.
He claimed he had secrets on politicians and secrets on other public officials, and he used that as a weapon.
But in a desperate game of secrets and lies, J. Edgar Hoover was both hunter and hunted.
He felt he was untouchable, that no one could dare touch him. But he was wrong.
Behind the public persona, his shocking private life nearly brought him down.
He had two major problems. One, he was addicted to gambling, and two, he was a blatant homosexual.
Next on Undercover History, delve into the secrets of J. Edgar Hoover.
J. Edgar Hoover was one of the giants. He personified integrity. He personified honor. He personified courage. He personified loyalty.
In May 1972, he was found dead on the floor of his bedroom at his home in Washington.
The greatness of Edgar Hoover will remain inseparable from the greatness of the organization he created and gave his whole life to building.
When the undertakers arrived, they found the house crawling with unidentified men in suits who were searching the house from top to bottom.
This is an end of an era.
The administration was terrified as to what secrets Hoover might have squirreled away on them.
J. Edgar Hoover built an empire within the U.S. government, an empire built on information. For close to 50 years, Hoover remained larger than life, more famous than movie stars, more powerful, perhaps, than presidents. But Hoover was a man who dealt in dark secrets and harbored many of his own. Now, decades after his death, with the help of Hoover's now public confidential files, historians and crime investigators are piecing together the secret life of the father of the modern FBI. In the 20s and 30s, waves of crime shocked the nation. The Great Depression spawned the murderous crime sprees of colorful but ruthless gangsters like John Dillinger.
Dillinger was a bank robber. He had some panache, he had some flair. You know, he'd jump the counter and doff his hat to the teller as he's robbing the bank. You know, he caught the public's imagination to some extent.
This desperate public enemy now rises to fame as an underworld hero. And that set the wheels of justice grinding with a vengeance. 500,000 of these wanted notices went far and wide.
Bandits like Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly, and Babyface Nelson shot their way through small towns across the country, and local police were helpless to stop them. The only federal law enforcement agency was a tiny bureau inside the Department of Justice.
It was a political job. If you knew Congressman so-and-so, you can get a job there. If you knew Senator so-and-so, you can get a job there. When the FBI was first formed, it was a federal investigative agency with no powers of arrest or anything like that.
Not only was it powerless, it had a terrible reputation.
There was a series of scandals involving the Bureau that occurred during the World War I and the post-war years. And there was a real serious question about the character of agents themselves.
The popular image was sometimes of either the corrupt prohibition agent or the Keystone Cops.
Facing criticism over the disgraced bureau, the Attorney General fired the director in 1924. In his place, he promoted an ambitious young Washingtonian named John Edgar Hoover.
Hoover used every influence he had in Washington to get the job. He was put in as an acting director at first, and he proved himself in a very short period of time that he was the only man for the job.
Not yet 30 years old, Hoover's work was cut out for him.
So when Hoover came in, there was a house cleaning of the Bureau, but at the same time, he imposed these very strict rules because he sought to create the image of the agent as a gentleman, an individual above reproach. And the result of this is you had this very tightly controlled organization.
Within 10 years, Hoover and his modernized crime-fighting force had killed or captured the most wanted gangsters in the country, including public enemy number one, John Dillinger. The young FBI chief stepped into the spotlight. He was now a star. Replacing the anti-hero gangsters in the American imagination was a new icon, Hoover's G-Man.
The G-Men at the scene of murder, an experimental case at the crime detection laboratory.
The image of the Bureau changed radically. The G-Man was someone who could fight with his fists and use his brain to solve criminal investigations. The Bureau was also equipped with a cutting-edge laboratory and identification records for all known criminals in the country. Hoover was using his new political clout to turn the FBI into the best law enforcement agency in the world.
Of course, was led by, at that point, the #1 cop in the land, J. Edgar Hoover.
But the new FBI didn't acquire its image by accident.
Hoover had a public relations staff which was bigger than any actor or actress has in Hollywood. Their job was to keep the FBI's name and Hoover's name in the newspapers every single day.
It was the Hoover Bureau of Investigation. He had a whole department called the Crime Records Division that really should have been named the Hoover Publicity Division.
If the ultimate goal was to improve the image of the FBI, the strategy was clear. The Bureau would be synonymous with one man, J. Edgar Hoover.
Well, he really controlled the press. I mean, the game in town and the game you play with the press is that you leak to them, and they are thereby indebted to you. And the press would not criticize Hoover.
And everybody believed J. Edgar, oh my God, J. Edgar Hoover, geez, he was like God.
May I emphasize that the Federal Bureau of Investigation is as close to you as your nearest telephone. It belongs to you. It seeks to be your protector in all matters within its jurisdiction.
When he first started the FBI and took over, he did a good job. He made it a good agency. It was highly respected and probably made it one of the best law enforcement agencies. But at that time, like everybody else in America, I was not aware of all his other activities that he had going.
Some of these activities began as the United States geared up for World War II. President Roosevelt authorized Hoover's FBI to use wiretaps and electronic surveillance in cases it deemed necessary for national security. This gave Hoover license to get involved in surveillance, wiretapping, and illegal break-ins, which the FBI called black bag jobs.
He was able to use the surveillance to his own ends, and this opened the way to a widespread abuse of civil liberties.
We refer to the Cold War era as the McCarthy era. I think that more properly we could refer to it not as McCarthyism but Hooverism. Bureau officials on their own decided who constituted a threat to the nation's security interests.
The result was a massive monitoring of American citizens. But Hoover's reach extended beyond spy hunting into the nation's bedrooms. Directing the FBI's investigatory powers against adulterers and homosexuals, Hoover began a crusade to defend moral virtue.
It was one of the things he was obsessed with, like communism. He came across as the conscience of the nation.
But it was a risky proposition for Hoover, who was himself the subject of open rumors about his own relationship with his #2 man at the FBI, Clyde Tolson. During a time when homosexuality was widely condemned, Hoover sought to project a morally upright public image.
The Bureau began in 1937 to collect information about homosexual activities.
Hoover was, of course, absolutely homophobic. He wanted to identify every homosexual in the United States.
In targeting homosexuals, Hoover authorized a secret program, codenamed Sex Deviate.
And the purpose of this program was to identify individuals who are homosexuals who might be employed in the federal government.
Homosexuality was outside of the FBI's jurisdiction. It wasn't a federal crime, but Hoover argued that homosexuals posed a national security threat.
In the 1940s and 1950s, when America was especially concerned about the possibility of Soviet penetration. It was thought, and there was evidence to support the thought, that people who were homosexual would be more prone to being blackmailed by the Soviets into doing something.
For Hoover, if anyone seemed suspicious or was vulnerable to blackmail, it was the FBI's responsibility to investigate them. Advances in surveillance techniques would give Hoover's agents even greater access into the personal lives of Hoover's friends and enemies, including the presidents under whom he served. Under J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI collected information on thousands of Americans. The secret files Hoover kept are the key to unlocking his immense power, but they remain wrapped in mystery. These files were kept separate from the FBI's central file system because of their sensitivity or because they contained information obtained illegally. When Hoover died in 1972, his personal secretary Helen Gandy began destroying the most sensitive files that Hoover had maintained for decades.
How much she knew about his very personal life, I don't know. She was his secretary for 40-some years, and he never once called her Helen. It was always Miss Gandy.
She'd been with him almost from the start, and she was fiercely protective of the director. And on that day, knowing that the files were no longer in Hoover's possession, she must have had a terrible quandary about what to do about them.
Nobody knows how many files Gandy destroyed or what precisely they contained. That allows conspiracy theorists to imagine the worst.
What survived was to lead those who examined the papers years later to conclude that the dirt in Hoover's private files was like looking into a sewer.
For its part, the FBI has denied that Hoover kept secret files on powerful Americans in order to blackmail them.
Miss Gandy said that these were things like personal correspondence with friends and business stuff and that sort of thing. It certainly wasn't the dirt files on the entire Congress and all the major political figures in Washington that, people kind of envision when they think of Hoover's secret files.
But historians and investigators who've studied the agency's records say there was much more to Hoover's secret files than Helen Gandy admitted.
These were non-record records, that is to say that they were not indexed and serialized in the FBI Central Record System, and thus theoretically did not exist. It allowed the FBI director to deny that the FBI was not doing what in fact it was doing.
We may not know everything that Hoover kept in the secret files, but we know a lot about how FBI agents gathered the information inside the files. Bill Turner was an FBI agent under Hoover in the 1950s and was trained in illegal surveillance.
I was selected in 1958 to go to the FBI Sound School. The Sound School was illegal. It was a program designed to teach the art and craft of bugging, tapping, and burglaries. Hoover did the illegal bugging and tapping because it was a shortcut to get information he couldn't get otherwise.
Turner participated in these so-called black bag jobs.
I remember we'd go in the afternoon, say, to this local secretary of the Communist Party USA's house while they were at work and take a document camera and document the membership lists of the party. Of course, we couldn't use that in a court of law because it was illegally obtained, but it steered us on to who was who in the party.
What happened over time is the evolution of a culture of lawlessness with the Bureau. That is, if you can do it and get away with it, you do it.
Hoover got away with it because nobody knew about it.
Nobody knew about it because the evidence gathered was stored in Hoover's secret files. Theo Harris has used the Freedom of Information Act to acquire over 17,000 pages of files that weren't destroyed after Hoover's death. They paint a fascinating picture of the director.
Hoover's files tell us a lot about the FBI director. They tell us that he was a very sophisticated bureaucrat who understood power very well. They also tell us that while he projected an image of being very deferential, in some cases very obsequious in his relationship with presidents, that he was his own man and pursued his own agenda.
Hoover's agenda was always centered on advancing the power of the FBI and maintaining his own grip on the agency. But that agenda was not always in line with the presidents he served.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
In 1960, 65-year-old J. Edgar Hoover was nearing the mandatory age of retirement as 43-year-old John F. Kennedy was elected. Hoover would now report to Kennedy's younger brother, Robert, the Attorney General.
Robert Kennedy sought to exercise his authority over the FBI director, an authority that had not been exercised since the 1940s, and Hoover was used to being his own boss, and all of a sudden there was this young whippersnapper who was essentially exercising his prerogative as Attorney General. So there was a very tense relationship between Robert Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover had been running the FBI for 35 years, but now his future was uncertain. There were rumors that the Kennedys wanted to fire Hoover.
But the Kennedys couldn't fire him because Hoover knew the Kennedy secrets.
When he heard that they were looking to get rid of him as far as director of the FBI, he simply went to John Kennedy, the president of the United States, in his office and said, you do this to me, and this is what I'm going to say about you.
Hoover had a lot to say about Kennedy, information the FBI had gleaned over many years, observing the playboy politician.
John F. Kennedy's affairs didn't sit well with him, both on a personal moral standpoint, but perhaps even more importantly on a security standpoint. It was something that could have compromised the president.
Hoover focused on an affair Kennedy had had in 1942 when he was in the Navy. The woman was a gossip columnist named Inga Arvid.
The FBI's interest was on Arvid, allegedly because she was a German spy, but this is sort of really a far-out allegation they pursued. And as a result of this, they wiretapped her and they picked up a conversation between Arvid and John Kennedy, who was then stationed in Charleston, South Carolina.
Based on that conversation, the FBI bugged the hotel room Kennedy and Arvid used for their liaison. In 1960, the Arvid investigation acquired a different dimension with Kennedy's nomination as the Democratic presidential candidate. Hoover transferred the Arvid folder to his official and confidential file.
So you have this earlier investigation that might not seem to have the value, but down the road it had considerably greater value.
They not only knew that information, but they had the tape recordings of their sexual trysts. And Kennedy spent his whole administration hoping to get those tapes back.
The treacherous dance between the young politician and the perennial FBI director continued throughout Kennedy's presidency. Hoover also had information on Kennedy's affair with Judith Campbell Exner, the girlfriend of a notorious Chicago mobster.
The FBI had wiretapped this organized crime figure, Sam Giancana.
Consequently, the FBI intercepted a series of calls by Judith Campbell Exner to the White House.
Hoover walked into Bobby's office and he laid down this report. This number has been calling the White House and put through directly to the president each time. And then he just kind of left it there.
On March 22, 1962, Hoover met with the president to inform him about Judith Campbell Exner's shady background. Some believe Hoover was blackmailing the president, but according to the FBI, Hoover was simply warning Kennedy of a potential threat to national security.
I don't see Hoover being able to blackmail the president, to actually come out and say, Mr. President, I know this dirty thing about you, and if you don't do what I say, I'm going to make this public. It kind of boggles the mind.
Hoover had developed a reputation as a bully who would not hesitate to destroy lives and careers to get what he wanted. Above all, Hoover inspired fear.
Hoover had information on everybody, especially the politicians. This was his way of controlling everybody. He knew how to do that. He was an expert in that area.
He made it his business to collect gossip. So no one wanted to fool with them because they were afraid an FBI investigation would begin and they would become exposed.
Hoover simply played upon their weaknesses, their skeletons in their closet.
They said he had a black book on everybody. Even when he went before the Congress, he would reach into his pocket, take out his little black book and just beat it like that on the table, and boy, and once they saw that, he got everything he wanted.
Neither the Congress nor the executive called him to account. He claimed he had secrets on politicians, and he used that as a weapon. That is no different than a mafia boss, in my opinion.
The currency of Hoover's power was information. Private information that people wanted to keep hidden. But the FBI wasn't the only organization that knew how to exploit secrets. Hoover faced a powerful enemy and had secrets that, if known, could bring him down. While Hoover was building the FBI into the best law enforcement agency in the world, a violent criminal organization was rising to unprecedented heights of power and influence, the American Mafia. Only Hoover could stop it, but he chose not to.
It certainly was in his best interest not to go after certain people.
Bill Bonanno is the son of New York crime boss Joseph Bonanno, who ran one of the 5 major mafia families during the time that Hoover ran the FBI.
Hoover was on his own, doing his thing, trying to accumulate his own power. And it's very interesting to me that his history and the history of our world was really parallel tracks. They both were trying to accumulate power, and they were both trying to dispense that power.
Because Hoover understood power, he knew it would be difficult to take down the sophisticated crime network the Mafia had become.
But also he knew that there's a vast amount of corruption connected with organized crime. He knew exactly what was going on. And he didn't want his agents exposed to it.
The threat of corruption was only part of why Hoover turned a blind eye to the vast criminal empire that was spreading across the nation.
Gambling is a vicious evil. It corrupts our youth and blights the lives of our adults. It becomes a springboard for other crimes, embezzlement, robbery, and even murder.
In public hearings, Hoover took a strong stance against gambling. But it is possible that his private gambling habit tied him to the very crime bosses he should have been hunting down.
Horse racing at historic Pimlico track outside Baltimore. 11 3-year-olds entered in the Preakness Stakes. 30,000 turf devotees are out for the 78th Preakness. Among them, FBI chiefs J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson.
Horse racing had become a cash cow for notorious mobsters Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, who had cornered the market on illegal bookmaking.
And they're off after fame and fortune.
In the end of the 30s and into the 40s and 50s, racing in this country was called the sport of kings. And people in my world, what public calls the Mafia, developed a system called The Wire. It was a method for people all over the country to be able to bet on horse racing.
J. Edgar Hoover liked horse races, loved them. He would attend them as often as he could.
If he was in Florida, you want to find him, go to the racetrack, he's there. If he's in New York and you want to find him, go to the racetrack in New York, you'll find him. He was a devout gambler. I'm telling you, just like a sick person is an alcoholic. He was like that.
Hoover made no secret of his love for gambling, but he insisted that he never wagered more than $2 on a race.
But the favorite correlation is gaining ground.
Hoover, I don't think, ever bet $2 in his life other than for a photo op. He would go up to the $2 window at the racetrack and bet the $2 and turn around and smile for the camera.
Bill Bonanno remembers seeing Hoover at the track with Tolson.
Hoover had a problem. He was addicted to gambling.
Away from the cameras, Hoover bet much larger sums on races. Even FBI agents had suspicions that Hoover's gambling linked him to crime figures like Frank Costello.
Hoover would meet on a park bench in Central Park with Costello, and Costello would give him the fixed races and he had agents place bets for him behind the counter when he was photographed at the $2 window. He knew via Costello which horse was destined to win.
Mr. Hoover enjoyed the benefits of betting on races that he knew. He didn't know he was going to win. He just knew that he was going to collect.
This is something that went on for years. So by looking after him at the track, he was beholden to the mobsters.
One fact gives credence to the theory that Hoover intentionally ignored the mafia threat. For decades, while the mob grew increasingly powerful, Hoover refused to acknowledge that a nationwide crime organization even existed.
From early in my career in the FBI, I knew that we didn't go against organized crime.
Hoover argued that going after the mafia was, for the most part, not within the FBI's jurisdiction. Costello was not the only one willing to curry Hoover's favor in exchange for lining his pockets. One of Hoover's closest friends was mob associate Clint Murchison, an oil magnate and owner of the Del Charro Hotel near the racetrack in Southern California.
Murchison cozied up to Hoover from the late 40s, and year after year, Hoover would go on his long summer vacations to the Del Charro, a resort that Murchison had established in California. There he would stay, there he would not pay the bill.
Clint Murchison undoubtedly believed that he was being protected by the Hoover from investigation. So it was a quid pro quo. Hoover was comped at the Del Charro. Murchison was free to skirt the law.
In order to keep Mr. Hoover happy, it's my understanding that Clint would put him in on deals, oil wells in Oklahoma and in Texas. And if the oil well came in, Hoover would get his share. If the oil well didn't come in, didn't cost him anything.
He had a lot of oil stock, and that's never been satisfactorily explained. But there was a great deal of freeloading that was going on in the top echelons of the Bureau.
Essentially, a group of very senior officials of the FBI who were helping themselves and lining their own pockets with goods and services provided either privately or with taxpayer funds.
John Dowd was in charge of an investigation into the corruption at the FBI during Hoover's tenure.
Mr. Hoover's personal behavior was appalling. I mean, he never paid for a meal. He had his house totally refurbished at taxpayers' expense every year. I mean, that is utter corruption. That is complete fraud. So he was committing crimes against the people of the United States, against the taxpayers of the United States.
Hoover is really the epitome of the old saying about power corrupts. If you can get away with a little and you get away with it long enough, then you get away with more. You realize that you can, and you do.
Deception, fraud, gambling, the J. Edgar Hoover that few Americans ever knew about during his lifetime. But Hoover might have gambled with even higher stakes when his secretive private life put his entire reputation on the line.
By fixing the races for him and for looking after Hoover at the track, the mob had something on Hoover, but almost certainly that wasn't the only thing they had on him.
Despite Hoover's celebrity, Americans knew little about the private man behind the public figure. A dark side of the FBI chief may have concealed secrets far more damaging than his gambling and his associations with the mob. Behind the tough guy image, Hoover was no ladies' man.
From the late 30s, Hoover became involved with the man who was going to be his constant male companion for the whole of the rest of his life. This was Clyde Tolson.
Hoover and Tolson had known each other from the 1920s when Hoover hired Tolson at the FBI. He impressed Hoover very early on and rose rapidly in the Bureau.
Tolson became the man who was always at his side, both as a friend but also within the Bureau. He was the axe man, the hatchet man, who would carry out Hoover's orders.
Until Hoover's death, the two traveled to work together most days. They would also go nearly every day to the Mayflower Hotel in downtown Washington to have lunch. The two men would always sit with their backs to the wall so that they could see anyone who might want to shoot them. Hoover and Tolson also took all their vacations together, usually to Florida or California. On these trips, the two friends took hundreds of photographs.
They photographed each other, and Hoover especially photographed Tolson. And there are pictures of Tolson asleep even. Men don't usually very often go around taking photographs of their friends asleep.
When we were asked as agents, say at a cocktail party, somebody would say, "Is your director a homosexual?" which was the word in those days. Our standard reply was, "Well, it's an unwholesome relationship."
You have two bachelors, two men never married, hanging out all the time together. Question arises, were they homosexual? And the answer is, there's no way to know.
No way to know unless there were witnesses to their liaison. Hoover took pains to protect his privacy, but he also took risks. Risks like frequent nights out at New York's famous Stork Club.
I remember being at the Stork Club in New York. That was the gathering place of just everybody who was anybody.
At the Stork Club, one would be elbow to elbow with the glamorous and the powerful of the day. But it was also a very dangerous place for J. Edgar Hoover. The club was run by a former bootlegger with close ties to the mob, and in particular Frank Costello, who was known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. This is the same mobster who allegedly took Hoover's off-track bets. Hoover and Tolson may have put themselves at risk and were possibly even spied upon while they were at the Stork Club.
There is an interpretation out there that because members of the underworld, the mafia, owned these various places, that they were places to gather information. There's no question in my mind that that was so.
It's now known that the Stork Club had two-way mirrors in the restrooms so that people could be spied on, and that some of the tables had secret microphones that recorded the conversations. The Stork Club was particularly dangerous because of the mob involvement and because of Hoover's vulnerability so far as his homosexuality was concerned.
Hoover and Tolson may have let their guard down at the club. Several patrons recalled an unusual sight witnessed one New Year's Eve.
Supposedly where Hoover and Tolson were holding hands. That was the only time that I can ever remember that being said of them in public.
But one small unguarded moment would not provide the leverage the mafia needed to control Hoover.
Several mafia sources spoke over the years about the mob having had something to hold over Hoover, and 2 or 3 of them said that they actually had seen proof that Hoover was homosexual.
The proof was a set of photographs. Whether or not the photographs actually existed may never be known for sure, but they acquired a mythical status nonetheless.
The person that controlled the photographs was Meyer Lansky. I mean, where he got them, I don't know where he got them from, but he's the one that controlled them.
They had photographs of him in a compromising position with another male, okay? Now, I know that Lansky, according to my source, had at least 3, maybe 4 such photographs.
Crime investigator Gallinaro claims he saw one of the photographs during his pursuit of mob associate Louis Rosenstiel in the 1970s.
I was shown one by my informant. I could identify Hoover, but I couldn't identify the male. Now, I know, people say, well, they got ways how they can docket these photographs. You know, they got a lot of ways that they can do all that. Maybe so. I'm not an expert in photography, but I know this looked pretty good to me, you know.
But there are far more shocking allegations. Allegations that, if true, reveal Hoover's reckless personal behavior. Hoover's friend Louis Rosenstiel allegedly invited his wife Susan to witness an orgy. She told Hoover biographer Anthony Summers what happened next.
They wound up going to a suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. And amongst the people present was a man dressed up as a woman in a fluffy dress with flounces and lace stockings and high heels, whom she recognized as J. Edgar Hoover. And that evening, 2 young boys in their late teens were brought in and had a form of sex game with the director of the FBI dressed up in drag.
The photograph I saw him in drag, standing in the room with a wig on and a frilly black dress, if I remember right, and fishnet stockings and high heels. And it was absolutely no mistake that it was our beloved Mr. Hoover.
Hoover's defenders say these outlandish stories are pure fiction.
There are a lot of salacious stories about Hoover. Not surprisingly, most of those have come out after his death. The one about Hoover in a dress, I certainly would chalk up to urban legend. If the mob had pictures of him, they would have been out and Hoover's reputation would have been destroyed decades ago.
The value of the photographs and the strength of those photographs required that nobody ever really see them, but people could talk about them. And each person that would talk about it would add something in their imagination.
The question that nobody's been able to answer has been, what happened? Why did Hoover not crack down on the mafia when he could have done? And although it has to be to a degree speculation, I think the mob found out about his sexuality, and this was something they could hold over him for all the years that followed.
Blackmail may have been one of the reasons why Hoover denied the existence of the mafia for decades. But in 1957, an unexpected event would make it impossible for Hoover to continue averting his eyes from the mob. By the 1950s, the mafia in the United States had grown out of control.
It was clear to anybody who was serious about law enforcement that there was such a thing as the mafia, that it was a serious and increasing problem, a cancer in American society. Yet Hoover behaved as though it didn't exist.
And in November of 1957, tucked away from the eyes of the federal law enforcement, an unofficial convention took place in the town of Appalachian, New York. The heads of the mafia families from all around the country gathered at the home of Joseph Barbara. A local state trooper noticed an unusual number of cars on a small side road on the way to the private residence. He began to take down license plate numbers. And when people at the meeting realized that the police were taking an interest, many of them scattered.
Apparently they all took off in every direction from the stories I heard. Some went through the woods, but 6 or 7 people who stayed in the house, they were the smart ones. And that raid became symbolic of putting the spotlight of publicity on this thing the American people called the mafia in the United States.
J. Edgar Hoover, like everyone else, found out about this mafia convention the next morning in the newspapers.
And it's very clear, very publicly clear in the papers and everywhere else that there really was national collusion going on. You know, these folks weren't simply meeting to have a beer and, you know, roast some hot dogs.
Hoover could no longer deny the existence of organized crime after the tremendous publicity that was given to the Appalachian Conference.
It brought out to a lot of people that if this went on and everyone knew about organized crime and the FBI didn't, there seemed to be something wrong with the FBI.
1957 was the year that J. Edgar Hoover had to sit back in that big sumptuous office of his and say, what the heck do I do now?
In response to Appalachian, Hoover set up the Top Hoodlum program, which required each FBI regional office to list their 10 most wanted gangsters.
Well, this was kind of ridiculous because in San Jose, California, there weren't 10 people involved. And yet in Chicago, you might have had 200. In New York, you might have had 1,000. You know, I mean, so it was just a safe-face mechanism. It went no place. It never accomplished anything.
I think after Appalachian, people began to realize that Hoover wasn't what he had been built up to be.
That's why things became so desperate at the end of the 50s and into the 60s.
Feared for his bare-fisted tactics, dogged by rumors, and now facing criticism for his failure to battle organized crime, Hoover was in the fight of his life.
Hoover had become a fixture, a seemingly immovable fixture, by the end of the 50s, but then there were tremors suggesting that perhaps he wasn't so secure.
In the late 1960s, Hoover's grip on power began to slip as stories of illegal surveillance hit the presses.
I, Richard Billhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. So help me God.
Hoover needed a friend in the White House, and with the election of Richard Nixon, an old anti-communist ally from the 1950s, he thought he had one. But the new president would prove too lawless and unscrupulous, even for Hoover.
As the presidency progressed, there was pressure on Hoover to do more nefarious things, more bugging, more illegal surveillance, and so on. Hoover saw the problems coming for the presidency and, to protect his own backside, tried to distance himself.
Nixon wanted Hoover to keep performing the kind of illegal surveillance he had built his career on.
Nixon could not believe that Hoover was doing these things and not doing them for him.
So there was a debate within the Nixon White House about whether Hoover was unduly cautious and that the FBI was not conducting the kinds of investigations that the administration wanted.
People around Nixon persuaded Nixon finally that it was time to tell Hoover that he had to retire as director of the FBI.
From the White House perspective, Hoover was no longer an asset. After 46 years, maybe it was time for him to go. Hoover was invited to breakfast with the president, and people at the Justice Department were sitting and waiting for the announcement from the White House.
The announcements never came because Nixon, who was never courageous about firing people, had simply not dared to do it.
I can say from personal knowledge that he is a man who has never served a party. He has always served his country, and he deserves credit for that.
Hoover died at home in May 1972 with Nixon still in office. Having served as the head of the FBI for nearly half a century, his power and influence were unmatched.
The fear of the files outlived Hoover, and Nixon was as worried as anyone about that. Some of the most secret material is still unaccounted for. The blackmail material on a great number of people.
People still rightly remember that iconic Hoover of the 1930s and 1940s, you know, the gangbuster and the spy buster. And yet, these newer suspicions have been creeping in and coloring that reputation.
It's amazing to me how everybody's pounced on J. Edgar Hoover after 1972. And I often wonder where the hell they were before 1972.
It was just a gradual process of erosion. People began to think maybe the things that we've been told all these years about the Bureau being so infallible and so perfect aren't true.
What has emerged about Hoover's abuses of power, his attacks on civil liberties, and his pressures on politicians has tarnished his reputation. Yet years after his death, we still know very little about this deeply private man.
When Hoover died, Tolson was effectively the widow, publicly and indeed privately.
Hoover had named Tolson his executor and left him the bulk of his estate.
And at the funeral of Hoover, it was a shattered Clyde Tolson who was handed the flag that had been on the director's coffin.
Many of J. Edgar Hoover's secrets followed him to the grave, but others, those contained in the surviving secret files, began to spill into the public realm.
There's no doubt that had Hoover remained alive and you had these inquiries as well as a release of records, that Hoover would not have remained as FBI director. He would have been fired on the spot because there had been clear evidence of his abuses of power.
Obsessed with power and plagued with troubling secrets, J. Edgar Hoover was destined to live a double life. Crime fighter and mafia pawn. Spy catcher and blackmailer. American hero and American hypocrite. Hoover will be remembered as all of these, but it's not the way the most powerful director in the history of the FBI would have wanted it.
And now, my parting words, I give you the motto of the FBI, its heritage: fidelity, bravery, integrity. May you cherish it as we do, and may you exemplify it as we have sought to do. I thank you.